Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. This week I'm going to do an Ask Me Anything episode. As always with my AMAs, I've collected some questions from online and I'm just going to go through as many as I can. And as always, this is my sort of off-the-cuff live reaction to them, so a bit more of an informal episode. Don't absolutely take everything I say as writ, but this is this is my sort of first take on a lot of the stuff people have asked me. Let's just jump right in. So to start with, is there a UK equivalent of the US wine mums TM that are so important to the current US resistance? I love this question, and this is, I think, something I want to think and write about more. My first pass is, I think, something like that is emergent, but not yet actualized. We don't have a sort of political archetype or stereotype, or not a well-known one, at least as far as I'm aware, that corresponds to that, because the wine mum, there's sort of different labels for it. You know, we've talked about in often quite derogatory and sometimes quite sexist ways. Pussy hat liberals, resist libs, wine mums. There's this meme recently of Evelyn Normie Lib. Sort of all riffing off a similar sort of idea, right? I don't know that we have that in the UK. If you're looking for sort of like a political tribe in the UK that's progressive but not like sort of anti-establishment socialist left, like fiercely anti-fascist and sort of quite socially liberal, I think there is something like that emergent. You know, the Labour Party has lost since being elected something like 60% of its voters, which is an astounding figure. That's, you know, to put it in context, the Bernie or Bust movement, of which we've had so many debates and bitterness and animosity, was maybe 4% of the total vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016, or her vote would have been 4% larger. Potentially determinative, but like an order of magnitude different. Most of that vote has gone to other progressive parties. The Greens are doing very well. They're at about 14-15%. The Liberal Democrats are up. And there's a lot of voters just sitting on, I don't know, or in Scotland or Wales voting for the progressive regional parties. So there's definitely an appetite for something that's overtly pro-immigration, pro-refugee, pro-trans rights, um, anti-reform that isn't being served by the sort of centre-right or even sometimes quite far-right track of the current Labour Party. It hasn't settled into any party, and I don't know how politically active it is, but this is the sort of like teachers, nurses, suburban mums sort of liberal voter, as opposed to like the sort of types of voter you might think of as more in the sort of what we do have certainly is there is a UK equivalent of like the Bernie Sanders left, and in fact that ran our Labour Party for quite some time. If you imagine an alternate history where Bernie Sanders won the one of the presidential primaries, but then went on to lose the general election, um, two general elections actually in the UK, one closely and one quite disastrously in 2017 and 2019, respectively. But an alternate history where Bernie Sanders ran the Democratic Party for a bit, did very badly, and then was eventually booted out, and was also much stupider than Bernie Sanders is. That's sort of the UK. So there is definitely that faction. Um, Corbyn has tried to start his own party since then. It has been a disaster. I think most of that faction is now just within the Greens. But then there is this also sort of more, I guess, normie progressive liberalism. What I haven't seen yet in the UK is I think you have seen a political realignment of that sort of like progressive liberalism through the parties. What you haven't seen is it sort of active in protest movements. I've done a few anti-Trump protests in the UK outside the American consulate. I've done some activism vis-a-vis refugee rights and trans rights, and the people who show up to that are still more in the sort of like anti-establishment left quadrant. And I'm not like knocking that at all. Like we need people in the streets, but you haven't seen the sort of wine mum activation properly yet. I think it's emergent. I think we will see it, but I think we haven't seen it yet. Which is unfortunate because I'm not knocking the anti-establishment left here at all, but I think there is kind of a ceiling on their numbers, and I think you need to activate the more sort of mainline liberalism to really sort of get the mass resistance that you're seeing in America. I mean, I think when you did see mainline liberalism activated in the UK, it, in a sort of passionate way, it was in response to Brexit. There was on the sort of Remain side, there was a very sort of passionate liberal response to that, but that's kind of died out as that battle was apparently now quite decisively lost, and it hasn't really reattached itself to anything. Um, but if I'm being optimistic, the fact that it was there about Brexit, I think, hopefully at least, means that it could be there about something else. So anyway, that's that. And then someone, as a sort of follow-up, which goes to quite nicely, asked me just in general terms, what do I think of the Greens in the UK? I think there's a lot to praise there. Um, so the Green Party in the UK, for US listeners, has, I mean, it's a third party. It has never been a particularly major force in UK politics, but it's a bit more of a thing than it is in the US. It is a vehicle for protest votes every 4 years in presidential elections, whereas the Green Party does actually have MPs. Like, not many of them, but they're there, and I think they will probably increase their I mean, almost certainly will increase their representation next election, and they're polling at like I say, 14-15%, whereas like in America, like the total third party vote, including like the libertarian vote and so on, I think was like 5% in 2016, which was a high watermark, and then lower in other elections. Um, so it's more of a thing here. It's still very complicated, like if and when it strategically makes sense to vote Green, because we do have a first past the post system. But they're doing very well. Their new leader, Zach Polanski, seems to be doing a really good job of it. I like a lot of what I've heard. He's been unapologetically pro-refugee, pro-trans rights, which is really nice because in the UK it seems like just everyone has lurched to the hard right on those issues. Um, I need to look up. I haven't really line by line everything he's ever said and like sort of gone through it and really. I need to look a bit more closely because he said some things that sort of sound a bit worrying on NATO, and there is a sort of anti-establishment left tendency to not be brilliant on Ukraine, particularly. But I've also heard people say that actually, if you sort of look at the details, what he said is actually more sensible than it's made out to be. I haven't gone into that yet, so I don't have like a hard view. Um, in general, I think there's a lot to like there. I don't have an opinion yet on like what the best anti-fascist vote will be in the next British general election. I think we just don't know, and I think it will almost certainly largely depend on which seat you're in. I don't think there will be an answer to what the best vote to cast is. I think it will depend on where you are. So this isn't an endorsement, but there is a lot to like about Zach Polanski and his project. And like some people say, oh well, he isn't serious. He couldn't govern. Well, I mean, the government lot aren't serious, and they can't govern, so that's a wash, isn't it? And there's a lot to like. There's a couple of things I'm potentially concerned by, and I also just don't know what the polling will be like a year, 2 years from now in the next election. I don't even know how this current scandal with Mandelson and so on will play out. I don't know what the future direction of the Labour Party will be. So I don't have like a hard, I'm definitely voting for them. But from what I've seen, is generally pretty positive. He was when I did my episode on like ranking politicians for their anti-fascism, he scored the highest of any party leader in the UK. So there's another positive to him there. Okay, moving on. Let's go back to the US. The left usually assumes that if you address material concerns, you can win over the white working class. I think we have evidence that that is not the case, and they value cultural issues over material issues until a certain point, maybe. What do you think? Can you win an election by addressing material concerns enough to get 50% most of the time? If so, how do you do it, or is it a cultural issue? Yeah, so let me just make a few general points here. First, like, it does kind of depend what we mean by white working class, because this is a term that gets thrown around. Are we talking income level? Are we talking like type of profession, like, manual labor or trade versus office job? Or are we, I think a lot of times what's actually meant when we say white working class is without a college degree, which correlates to but is not the same thing as income or profession type. We are, I mean, unquestionably seeing education polarization in the state. We're seeing that everywhere, but we're seeing it, definitely seeing that in the States. I think the relationship between, say, income and voting patterns is much more complicated. Yeah, at its simplest, both Trump's strongest support and his strongest opposition are cross-class coalitions. So you shouldn't assume that lower income white people are necessarily socially conservative. That is actually, if you squint, you could probably argue it the other way, that they're actually a shade more socially progressive than, say, middle income white people. But like, it's not a one for one at all. So that's a sort of preamble. I mean, I think we have to say that the Biden political strategy of spending money, going big, running the economy hot, and raising wages for the lowest earners did not work as a political strategy. I think we just have to bite that bullet. I wish it did. I really want that to work as a political strategy, and at least part of me thought it would. I never thought it was everything. I thought it might make some difference at the margin. Um, and there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, to what extent was it communicated poorly? I think it was. To what extent did the media cover it poorly? Exceptionally. Um, to what extent could someone else have sold it better? I think at least somewhat. I don't think Harris did a brilliant job either, if I'm being honest. I think they lacked a clear narrative about it. Now, if you're asking me specifically why do lower income Americans vote Trump, then almost certainly the answer is cultural issues rather than economic. We have, I think the data on that is pretty robust at this point. I mean, the sort of economic anxiety narrative persists, but I think the numbers are in on that one. To this sort of question about what do you do about that strategically, look, I don't have all the answers on like this is a surefire way to win any election. Elections are big, complex, multivariate things. I mean, I think what I would say is I think people often approach what it is that voters vote on as something that is fixed, i.e., they have a model in their head of, let's just say a reactionary centrist has a model in their head that the median voter wants a sort of moderate policy offer that is culturally conservative ish and maybe a little bit economically progressive, but not massively so. And if you the person who can get the closest to that policy offer, that's what people will vote on. Now, there's very, very good reasons to think that that's a faulty model of the electorate, but like that's one model. Or you could have a model that people want a radically socialist alternative. so on and so forth. Or you can have a model that people have these cultural concerns, whereas in reality it's different and different people vote for different reasons. But where I'm going with that is the criteria that people vote on are in themselves what is being contested in an election, right? When you're making an argument to the electorate, you're not just making an argument that, say, I'm meeting your preferences. You're making an argument to the electorate about what their preferences ought to be. Like, and if you want a world where voters vote on material economic benefits, you have to argue for that world. You have to say to electorates, what I think you should be voting on is this. And that's an argument that you can make. And people I mean, people are often very entrenched in their political views, but they can be persuaded, right? So to take another case, let's just say, as conjecture rather than hard fact, that a majority of the electorate associates immigrants with criminality, either coming here illegally or committing crimes while they're here. And, you know, you can understand elections as a competition to fulfill that preference, which is often how centre-left parties do. They say, oh, well, we're actually the ones you can trust on this issue, and we're really going to get tough on the border. And actually, Republicans, they talk tough, but they don't do anything. That was kind of Kamala Harris's argument, right? So you can try and satisfy that preference, or you can make the case that it's the wrong preference. You can make the case that, and this is pretty statistically true, that actually in almost every developed country, first generation immigrants commit less crime than the native born, that in almost every developed country the electorate thinks that the population who are here illegally is much higher than it actually is. That's true pretty much in all developed countries, and that in almost all developed countries electorates have a very factually false view about what the main types of immigration are, and they tend to massively overestimate the harms of immigration and massively underestimate the benefits of it. So to my mind, like, the long-term strategy has to be to not to try and fulfill the preferences of the median voter, but to contest those preferences. There's in political theory, there's this idea from Luke's that there's like three dimensions of power. There's like decision making power, agenda setting power, and then like values and analysis power. There's like the power to say, is it A or B? There's the power to say, well, to define the choices between being A and B in the first place, and then like the power to inform the frameworks people bring to thinking about that might lead them to decide one way or the other. And I think when you're making political arguments, including but not exclusively, in running an election, that's one type of a political argument. You're contesting all three, right? Like, you're simultaneously saying, I think it should be A. You're also often saying, well, that's actually not the choice, that's not the parameter. You're also saying this is like the thought process we should be bringing to it. You're doing all of them all the time. And I think in electioneering, I'm going on about this a bit, but we can often just limit ourselves to that first dimension and and allow the sort of agenda setting and framework side to kind of like surrender that. And I don't think we should. Now, in saying that we should contest it, that doesn't mean that we necessarily win. But that you can at least try. Let's see what else we got. Same person, different question. I'm of the opinion that we need some sort of mass tribunal to deal with the criminals and private sector collaborators of this administration, I'm guessing meaning Trump here, when it becomes politically feasible. Can something be done while convincing enough of the public that the trials are legitimate? I'm worried that a large portion of the public doesn't see them as legitimate, and this will be a regular practice going forward with every administration. Also worried that if this isn't done, then a large portion of the public won't see any of the federal government as legitimate going forward. I mean, you accurately describe the situation. Um, I don't know. I don't know what the reaction from the political right would be. I mean, the reaction to Trump going on trial did not seem, and indeed actually getting a conviction in the case about him paying Cohen back, um, didn't seem to move the needle at all on his support. I think that's a lot of that is a function of the sort of media ecosystem people follow. If that media ecosystem changed, their views might. I but I also don't want to project forward from that too much in thinking, well, because it didn't change once means it wouldn't change again. I also think it's just an open question on how people would react to more mid-level people going on trial. Certainly, if you ask, should, say, the officer who shot the officers who shot people in Minneapolis, should they go on trial? You get something like 60-40 for it. Like, it's a reasonably popular proposition. I mean, ideally, you'd want that to be like a 90-10 thing, but it's not a 50-50 thing, you know? Um, so I'm not sure what the public reaction will be. It may well be blanket opposition from the entire right side of the spectrum. That could very well be the case. Um, I think you just have to do it anyway. Like, I think you have to make the case for its legitimacy, but I think you can't not do what needs to be done because you're worried, because you want everything you do to be perceived as legitimate by everyone. I think that's what slowed down a lot of the criminal repercussions for Trump under Biden. From what I understand, and this is very contested, and people sort of I've heard people I respect make both sides of this, but Merrick Garland went slow and delayed a lot investigating Trump because he was worried it would look political. And I think you've just got to do it. And to maybe flip it, the fact that Merrick Garland proceeded with such caution and sensitivity, and let's just say that he did proceed with this really sort of heightened sense of optics, um, has not stopped Trump on retaking power, pursuing a whole load of completely bogus prosecutions. So if your worry is if we prosecute them for legitimate reasons, they'll prosecute us for bullshit reasons, that's going to happen anyway, right? They will prosecute us for bullshit reasons anyway. We're already seeing colossal, massive abuses of the justice system, really without precedent. That will continue happening as long as these people are in power, and if they get back in power, it will happen again, right? So I think this is just like, it's not like, oh, if we shoot at them, they'll shoot back. They are shooting back. They're shooting at us. We can defend ourselves or not. Like, and there's no guarantee of success. But yeah, I think we just have to do it. I don't know. I think you do what has to be done, and you do it in as legitimate a way as possible, and you make the case for its legitimacy. But I don't. I think the doing what has to be done is prior. I don't think the legitimacy concern can come first. And to get to the point where we're doing that does assume reasonably large democratic majorities in both houses and control of the presidency, which, given the structure of our electoral system, assumes that we're winning the popular vote by at least a reasonably robust margin. So all of this is kind of preconditional on us having public support anyway. So yeah, I mean, I know that's a bit of a bleak answer, but I think we can do it. I think like if you look at support for prosecuting ICE, it's actually reasonably high, and so I think that is something you can campaign on and win majorities on, and then I think you just do it, and I think you try and bring the right round as much as possible. A lot of this is about media ecosystems and so on, and that's a whole other conversation what we do about that. But yeah, that's what I think. There, I think you've just got to do it. Okay, pinging back to the UK. I mean, dual national mode today? Feels like kind of a stupid question, but I'd be interested to hear you make the strongest case possible that we should be alarmed about reform. Would be good to have an on hand for people who aren't super tuned in. Not a stupid question at all. Great question. Like, I think everyone gets the vibe reform's not fond of immigrants, and Farageism is a bit of a cult of personality. But is it fascist? Is it anti democratic? What's the concrete evidence here? Cool. So let me just pull something up so I can cite this directly. Um, so the basic answer here is yes. What is the evidence? You listen to what they are telling us they plan to do. So in August of 2025, so actually for a while now, Reform have had what they call, in their own words, a UK version of Project 2025. That's not some Project 2025 for British listeners being the sort of core planning doc that that has informed the sort of first year and a half of Trump's governance. Like, they sort of told us in advance what they were going to do, and we, meaning sort of people on the left who don't like Trump, were called hysterical for sort of saying this is what they're planning to do, and then they did it, and everyone was so shocked. So Reform have their own version of this. I would recommend an article by Elia Ayub, who was just on the podcast on fascism, called Inside Reform's Plans for a Fascist Takeover, and that will detail it. But essentially, in and again, this is what they are telling us they plan to do. In the document that Reform describes as a British Project 2025, it includes plans for a British version of ICE. It includes plans for a concentration camp of 24,000 people, for mass surveillance, from withdrawing from any form of international law, from refugee law, from anti torture law, and from anti trafficking conventions, specifically, and this is all on their website. Right. So the answer to, like, would Reform do the things that we see Trump doing, is they are explicitly telling us that they will do these things. And actually, I'd let me just make a bit of a that's your first answer. Your second answer is it's the same thing. Nigel Farage was an enthusiastic supporter of Trump the whole way through, all three elections, right? It is the same. These are different national manifestations of the same thing. And if you look at sort of what the British online activist right are saying right now, it's the exact same thing as Trumpism. Like, the sort of core impetus of this movement is exactly the same. And in fact, I would argue British conservatism right now, in terms of the plans that it is floating, is actually more extreme in some respects than its American equivalent. So, not Reform, but the Tory party, if you want to read my last article. Oh God, I forget what it's called. The Tories' Dangerous Drift, in the Bulwark. My last article in the Bulwark details this a bit. The Tory party recently floated deporting 4 to 7% of the British population. Not 4 to 7% of immigrants, 4 to 7% of all of us, and that includes legal residents. Reform has floated something similar. They've gone back and forth on this, as have the Tories, but removing indefinite leave to remain. Um, the largest, even Trump was running on deporting undocumented people. Deporting legal residents is really unusual in the modern age. Like, the closest analog anyone could find was Idi Amin's expulsion of Uganda's Asian population. What seems to be emerging as the consensus position on the British right, both Reform and the Tories actually, although they go back and forth on whether they officially say it, but it seems like what the activist base believes, is a forced deportation of legal residents, something like 40 to 50 times the size of what Idi Amin did. It would be the largest forced movement of people since the partition of India. to kind of put it in scale. Um, that is sort of where the British right is at right now, and there just isn't anymore any sort of centre right left. I mean, even relative to a year ago, um, the right wing press, the Tory party, Reform, obviously, are all just way more radical than they were even when they lost the last election. Um, so I hope that answers your question and gives you a few resources to draw down on. But yeah, we should all familiarise yourself with this. My perspective has always been whether or not we call it fascist you know, isn't the main thing. I'm pretty comfortable using the fascism word, but like, if other people don't want to, I'm not necessarily going to fight them on it. I think the main thing is it a threat to liberal democracy? Clearly, evidently. I don't know if we come back from electing reform. It is the same thing as Trumpism. It's the same global movement. They are very clearly pro-Trump and they're very clearly imitating Trump in terms of what they plan to do vis-a-vis using immigration enforcement to take us into an authoritarian state. So that's my answer there. Okay, back to the US again. I assume this is a US based one, but it might not be. Another comment asks about white working class, which I've answered already, valuing culture over material issues. I tend to blame the media ecosystem these folks choose to immerse themselves in, rather than thinking they have a coherent theory or any knowledge about policy or issues. How can that change? I mean, you almost answer your own question there. Yeah, I mean, I think the media people consume is huge. I mean, what I would say is do sort of most voters on the political right have like detailed policy preferences? No, probably not. But people have values systems that they bring to politics, and they are sort of selecting. They are selecting media based on their value systems. And I mean, I think what you see sort of across the board with media is whereas in the past people sort of might read a general newspaper that aims to provide news to people across the spectrum, people are increasingly seeking out media that aligns with their value system. So, like, you see, but the Washington Post just laid is failing very badly, it seems, and just laid off a huge load of people because it didn't have a clear value system, I think, for what it represented. It didn't want to be anti Trump. It didn't want to do the democracy dies in darkness thing anymore. It kind of wanted to try and appeal to both sides. But the people who have, like, the conservative value system, they want media that feeds that. And the people who have a, a liberal, a progressive value system, they want media that speaks to that. They don't, nobody wants centrism anymore. And there's sort of different species of that. Like you could have something like I mentioned, the Bulwark. That's like we hate Trump, but we're not far left. Oh, cool. That's a lane. That's like a values position, you know. So it's maybe a bit more nuanced, but I think you need a. I think people are increasingly seeking out media based on values now. Um, and yeah, and I agree on the right, there's certainly a huge amount of misinformation, and a lot of what that media system feeds them is just flatly factually untrue. Um, I mean, I think a lot of these questions like sort of revolve around how do we talk people out of this, and I think the short answer is like you can, but it's hard. Like there's not, I do believe in a duty to persuade. I do think you are going to have if people who are both feet in this, you're going to have a really hard time. Like, there's no point sugarcoating that. They are challenging to persuade. I think there's a lot of people on the sort of periphery of it who have sort of, maybe voted Trump, maybe abstained, like have a lot of misconceptions in their head, but they're not like locked in. They can be talked out of it. I've talked people out of this. You can talk people out of this. And I think there's a duty to try, but it's going to be a lot of work. I mean, I do think get your parents off Fox News if you can. I think I've had conversations with people. I had a conversation with someone quite recently in the UK where I said, look, this is what I do. This is something I talk about all the time. I talk to academics about. This is like my field, and I am telling you that outlets like the Mail, the Telegraph are lying to you. and they're lying to you, sort of, they're taking you for a sucker. They're lying to you in order that they can be better off at your expense. And I sort of detailed a bit how and like some of the patterns in media coverage that we see in the UK and like what the actual facts are. And I think I did get through to some degree of like just like very simple as just stop reading it. Like get your information from elsewhere, you know? Because I think some people can sort of just reflexively pick up media habits without like maybe too much thought in them. So I think, we should be trying for the sort of more peripheral people who are perhaps sort of falling into it a bit. Or I can often just tell by the way someone's talking that they've been watching like new right content online. And I will just say to people, I think it sounds like you've been watching a bit too much Ben Shapiro, you know? Um, but yeah, there's not like oh, we do this one simple thing and everyone stops paying attention to this sort of factually false right media, because the reason they're going to that is values, and you have to talk people out of those values, and that can be done, but it's much harder. I think on the perimeter, there's a lot of people who might sort of be like 1 foot in rather than both feet in, and those you can talk out of it, and you should absolutely try. You know, make the best case you can. Okay, let's do one from Facebook, and then depending on the time, I might wrap. Recent reactions to the extent of the Epstein scandal have reignited a sense that maybe the left had a solid critique of power all along, but that framing usually engages in the overwhelmingly common and widespread misunderstanding of the leftist critique as being personal, as in the people with wealth and power are bad. No matter what we say, most people struggle to even understand the basic idea that we are putting forth that the structures that govern and manage wealth and power are bad, and that they train and sort for bad behaviour from those which inhabit them, particularly at the top. How do we break through the allergy against structural and systematic critique from people pardon me, intent on reading everything as a personal critique? Okay, another great question. I mean, I'll add one element to it, which isn't just structures. I think power itself tends to make people worse. I think you see this in your day-to-day life. Sometimes the worst thing you can do for someone is give them a little bit of power. We've all seen, like, God knows, the doorman at a nightclub who just gets absolutely drunk off this tiny little bit of authority on deciding who comes in and not. And it just makes them a jerk. Not every doorman, of course, but you know the archetype I'm drawing on there. Um, and like times that by a million for like some of these billionaires and like tech bros and so on. Like it's clearly broken their brains a bit. And I think that is just a function of like having power. And I think, when we in the modern world hear this sort of axiom of like all power corrupts, I think we think of like taking bribes or doing bad things. And what we're saying is it degrades you. Having no one to tell you no, or having other people under your thumb, damages you and it makes you a worse person and it leaves you in a state of spiritual isolation. And I think that's pretty like throughout human history, people have sort of noticed this one, like from Plato's tyrant to the modern day. Like Elon Musk seems like a pretty Plato's tyrant type to me, and that lens has been used to talk about Trump a lot as well. And then yeah, like I think certainly our institutions aren't consistently doing a good job of elevating the most wise and moral people to positions of leadership, right? I don't know, I'm perhaps less pessimistic than the questioner. I think that sort of critique is pretty intuitive for most people. I could only go like by the reaction to my own work here, but I made something a bit like this critique in an article called The Politics of Humiliation. And it actually is a consistent theme that I come back to in my work. I talked about this in my first big article, Disease of Affluence. I sort of I circle back to these sorts of themes every now and again. I find people are really responsive to it. I mean, maybe I'm writing for an audience that sort of skews liberal or left, so is like, predisposed to hear them anyway. But I find these sorts of ideas are pretty common sense to a lot of people, and I think if you even like think about like workplaces, if you say to people, it's not like an accident that we always seem to get the same sort of people in senior management, I think that will click for everybody. And I've been thinking about this a bit recently. I don't know if I might do an article on it or something. I don't know. It's a thought bouncing around my head. It's like modern political parties seem to have developed, like particularly centre left political parties, a habit of elevating people who aren't very good decision makers. I know that sounds wild because that's like the thing a politician does, and it wasn't always true of them. But I would even compare, I don't know, someone like Keir Starmer unfavourably to someone like Tony Blair. Like Tony Blair, was a centrist certainly, and there's a lot of stuff I disagree with in his record, but could make decisions. Could make a tough call that was going to have people mad at you either way. Whereas the current crop they really, really struggle with it, and I think there's something structural there. I think like the way the party is functioning as an institution is meaning that we tend to weed out the conviction politicians on their way up in an age that is increasingly driven by deep values. It's not working. The way the institution is elevating people isn't working. And then certainly when you look at big corporations and so on, the people who rise to manage them, there's certainly a structural critique you can run there as well. There's a bit of a waffly answer, sorry about that. Basically, no, I agree with the sort of premise of the question. And I think this is a sort of like the idea that we're systematically elevating the wrong people, and I think that like there is a danger in power being too concentrated, both because the wrong people might get it, but also because concentrated power just does tend to do funny things to a bloke's head. I don't know. These are all ideas I see in the ether, and that I think click for people and that they respond to when I write about them. So, as with with all of the persuasion questions, I think we as liberals can sometimes get a bit too much in the back of our own heads and like too much in the sort of how do we sell this as opposed to just like what do I think is true, you know, level of analysis. Like I think for a lot of like how do we convince people, either winning an election or adopting a political framework. All I can say is like I'm making the case as best I can, and I encourage you to do the same. And there may not be a right answer, like I'm doing it one way and I'm sort of modeling a particular way to make arguments. And if people find that useful and want to pick up stuff from my work, great. But it might be that for the types of audience you have, the types of, relationships you're within, the types of people you talk to, it might be that a different way of making those arguments is better. I think sometimes we can also get into like a one size fits all where there is just sort of a correct messaging, and like you see this for instance with like, oh, is abolish the right word for what we want to happen to ICE? Should we call it replace, or like, yeah, I don't know, like different. I think we can get hung up on that question a bit. Like I think different words will land with different people. Like I'm comfortable with abolish. If you wanted to call it replace, as long as we're clear about what we want, you know I think we can sometimes get too hung up on that. Like, and also we just don't know. You don't know what's going to land. I think there's better and worse framings. I try to make the case for the things I believe in as best I can. Um, but I think it's more important that you try to make the case, that you try to stop people around you being pulled into harmful and pernicious and bigoted ways of viewing the world. I think it's better to try in a way that maybe doesn't have the perfect framing or is maybe a bit clumsy than to not try at all, you know? Um, So I know what people really sort of want from political commentators, of which I am, I guess, a very, very minor one now, is like, here's the framing and here's what to say that'll like flip anybody. But there isn't. There isn't some magic words. On any issue, I can sort of tell you, well, this is how I say it. This is how I think about it. This is what's convincing for me. And I think what's convincing, what sells you personally on it will often be the most convincing thing. Not because it's like absolutely the most persuasive in any absolute sense, but if you tell people why you're convinced, then that will be authentic. And it will be more credible to people because I think it will show and they will pick up on the fact that you believe what you're saying. You know, I think sometimes, even if something is theoretically, in a focus group, polls a bit higher, it can often be the wrong way of saying things because it's not natural to you, you know? And I think we all can sense when politicians are using like focus group tested language rather than just telling us why they're sold on it. So again, I think a lot of these were about like how do we say things. There's better and worse ways. If you read my articles, listen to my podcasts, you'll get from me this is how I say it, and I've given some hints of that, today. But I make the case, try and persuade people. Don't be worried about saying it slightly wrong. Just tell them why you find it convincing. You know, and understand that you won't always succeed. Like sometimes people just can't be talked out of it, but enough can that it's worth trying. So, I hope that's like a guardedly optimistic way of sort of responding to this sort of general thing. So just give it a solid go, and tell people what you find convincing. Um, yeah, and I'll leave it there. Thanks for tuning in for this AMA. Back to regular programming next week.